Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Between Two Worlds and happy Yuletide, winter solstice, however you celebrate it. I hope it is in a way that is meaningful to you, or if you simply wish to just rot and become buried under the offerings of winter, I'm here for that too. Either way, I welcome you to this episode where we are going to talk about winter. Not Yule specifically, not the celebration of the solstice. Honestly, I think there's tons of podcasts out there that just do it really beautifully, but what winter actually brings in all of its forms. The one that, takes you under, the one that buries you in the cold, dark earth and doesn't really let you up until something has fundamentally changed. The winter that our ancestors didn't romanticize because really they were just too busy surviving it. And the winter that still lives inside of us, whether we acknowledge it or not. So I think really this topic opens up a a bigger conversation, about dissent, about pressure, about the kind of transformation that only happens when you go deep enough. Stay under long enough and let the weight of the dark do its work for you. This sort of internal alchemy of letting yourself be fundamentally changed by the cold. And because, here's the thing, most of what I see in witchcraft spaces around winter is either cozy aesthetic content or rushing past the dark to celebrate the returning light. And I absolutely understand that, and especially the impulse, but I think, we're missing something essential about what winter actually is and what it's asking of us. So let's start by reframing what winter is, at least in the sense that I'm talking about, because I think we've given the wrong language for it. Everywhere you can see in, well, the witchcraft spaces, winter is described as death. The death of the year, the dying of the light, the season when everything ends, everything stops, everything goes still and cold and lifeless. And I understand why people use that language. The land obviously looks dead. The trees are bare skeletons, the gardens are empty, animals disappear, and the world really does just go quiet in a way that can feel like ending. But I don't really think death is the right word because death is final and death is an ending, which allows for rebirth. However, death is a period at the end of a sentence. And winter really isn't that. Winter isn't a period, it's an ellipsis. It's the dot of something continuing in a way that you just can't see yet. And what winter actually is dormancy. And dormancy is not death. Dormancy is descent. It's going underground, going inward, and going down into the dark, wet earth, where transformation happens invisibly, slowly, and in the pressure and the silence. Think about what's actually happening in nature right now. The trees aren't dead, they've pulled their energy down to their roots, deep below the frost line, where it's protected from the cold. The perennials in your garden aren't dead, they've died back above ground, but below their soil, the root systems are still very much alive and waiting. Seeds, they aren't dead, they're suspended, preserved by the cold, and holding within them everything they need to become what they're meant to become. They're just not doing it yet. They're waiting for conditions to change. And then there's the insects. I mostly think of the Hercules beetle. One of the largest beetles in the world spends the winter buried in the soil. It's not dead, it's not sleeping exactly, but it's transforming. This larval form literally dissolves, its tissues break down into something like primordial soup, and then it reconstitutes into the adult form. The creature that emerges in the spring isn't a rested version of what went under. It's fundamentally a different being, barely. Same creature, but a completely new form. And the cicada does something even more extreme. Depending on the species, cicadas spend anywhere from 2 to 17 years underground, 17 years in the dark, in the cold, in the pressure of the earth above them. And during all that time, they're not dead. They're not even really sleeping. They're slowly, invisibly transforming, growing, and becoming. And then one day, after years or even decades, they know it's time and they dig upward through the soil and they emerge. And this is what dormancy actually is. It's not death, it's not necessarily rest, but it's this sort of transformation under pressure, becoming something new in conditions that would kill anything that really tried to stay the same. And the cicada can't stay a nymph forever. The beetle can't remain a larva. The seed can't just be a seed indefinitely. They have to change. And the only way to change that completely, that fundamentally, is to go under, to let the world above forget about them, and to just surrender to the dark and the cold and really the pressure, and trust that something is happening, even when nothing appears to be happening. So that is winter. It's not death, it's this descent. Hello, Persephone. Not ending, transformation, not a period, but this ellipsis with something continuing in the silence that we just can't see yet. And this is what winter asks of us. Not to die, not to simply rest and wait for spring, but to go under and to descend into ourselves in the way that the beetle descends into the earth, to let the cold and the dark and the pressure do the work for us. And really, it's to trust that we're becoming something, even when we can't really perceive the transformation that's happening. And of course, this is going to be uncomfortable for us. We live in a culture that wants everything to be visible, measurable, and productive. And we want to see progress. We want to track our growth. We want to see evidence that something is happening. But winter just doesn't work that way. Winter is the season of invisible transformation. It has this funny way of just letting you know something is changing, but it purposefully leaves you in the dark, really. The reason that asks us to trust without evidence, to surrender without these guarantees, or to go under without knowing exactly what will be when we come back up. And the beetle doesn't know what's becoming, when it's dissolved into this soup in the soil. It's just trust the process, and it lets the transformation happen. So when I think about winter, about this descent, about going under, another thing that really comes up for me is the ocean. And I think there's obviously vastly lots of stuff you can do here when it comes to practice. Now, most of all my life, I really have been a full-blown forest mountain girl, but I did grow up around the beach, and the ocean is something I also hold very, very dear to me. I used to always go tide pooling and always at the beach as a kid. I had the sun bleached hair, and there's something deeper about the ocean when it comes to connecting it with winter. Even though winter is usually associated with the earth, maybe the frozen ground, the buried seeds, the creatures hibernating in dens and burrows, and that's all true, but water holds something that the earth alone doesn't capture. Something about the nature of descent that I can't quite articulate without talking about depth and about that pressure. About sinking into something that's so vast and dark that you lose all sense of where you are. And the ocean is that depth. It's what's beneath the surface. It's the place where pressure builds the further down you go, where light fades and then disappears entirely, where, things transform in ways that we can't even witness because we can't survive long enough to even watch. And winter pulls us down the same way that the ocean pulls things down into this cold and into the dark. There's this crushing deep where different rules apply, where the things that live on the surface can't survive, and the things that thrive in the depths would die if they rose too high. So think about what happens to the surface of water in the winter. It freezes, it becomes solid, still, apparently lifeless. And if you only looked at the surface, you'd think nothing was happening. You'd think, it was all death and stillness and waiting. But beneath the ice, life still continues. Fish swim slowly in the cold, dark water. Creatures move through the depths. The water itself is still liquid, still flowing, still alive, just hidden beneath the frozen surface. And this is winter within. The surface of our lives might freeze. We might, appear still, quiet, unproductive, withdrawn even. But beneath the frozen surface, something is still moving. Something is still alive, and something is transforming into the deep where no one can see it. Sometimes not even us. And It might not seem like it, but you can actually sort of become comfortable with this thing. I at least find it comforting, the idea that transformation doesn't require visible activity, that the most important changes might just be happening in the depths beneath the frozen surface, where, you can't track or measure or prove that anything is occurring, and you just have to trust that the deep is doing its work. So the ocean is also pressure. And the deeper you go, the more weight presses down on you. At a certain depth, the pressure really would crush an unprotected human body. But, life still exists down there. Strange life, transformed life, and life that has adapted to conditions that would kill anything from the surface. This is what internal winter really can feel like. The pressure of the deep, the weight of all that water above you, all the darkness, all the cold. It's not comfortable and it's not easy, but it's transformative. The pressure is what makes diamonds. So cliche, but the pressure is what forces the beetle's body to dissolve and reconstitute, and the pressure is what winter uses to change us. And the ocean is tidal. It doesn't just stay still. It's pulled by the moon, a distant force that we can't control, can barely understand, and whose effects we feel in our bodies and in our emotions and in the rhythm of our lives. But when I'm in an internal winter, I sort of feel this same tidal wave. Emotions rise and fall like waves. Some days the water is calm and I can float. Other days, waves are so big, you feel like you can barely keep your head above the surface. But I've learned that you can't control the tides any more than you can control the moon. I can only learn to move with them. And that is really where the magic happens, to ride the current instead of fighting it, to let the waves carry you instead of exhausting yourself trying to swim against them. And there's something here about the moon as a symbol of the deeper self that I've learned, kind of looking at it as, your higher self controlling these waves. It's part of us that operates on cycles and rhythms that our conscious mind doesn't control. The moon pulls the tides, whether we want it to or not. And something in us, you know, call it the higher self or the unconscious or the soul, pulls our internal tides, whether we want it to or not. And winter is when that pull is strongest, when the descent is most insistent, and when the deep is calling, and the only real choice is to whether we go willingly or we get dragged. So there's also this mythic resonance here that matters. In so many traditions, the underworld god is reached by water. You cross a river to get to the land of the dead. The Styx in Greek mythology, the Akron, the Sanzu River in Japanese Buddhist tradition. You descend through lakes, through wells, through the ocean itself. Water is the gateway to what lies beneath. Sedna, the Inuit goddess of the sea, lives in the frozen depths of the Arctic Ocean. She controls the sea animals that the Inuit depend on for survival, the seals, the walruses, the whales, and when she's angry or neglected, she withholds them. In winter, when hunting is hardest and survival most precarious, really, shamans would journey to the bottom of the ocean to visit Sedna, to comb her tangled hair and soothe her, to ask for help in the cold, dark months. They descended into the deep to negotiate with the power that lived there. And this is winter magic in really some of its oldest forms, descending to meet what lives in the depths. Going under the surface, under the ice, into the cold, of the deep, and not to escape but to engage, to build a relationship with the powers that rule the season of descent. And the drowned dead live there too, in the ocean. The things that sank and never rose, the ships and the sailors and the secrets that went down into the dark and transformed into something else, bones becoming coral, flesh becoming food for creatures of the deep, and stories becoming legends, becoming myths. And when we descend into our internal winters, we meet our own drowned dead. The parts of ourselves that sank, the dreams that went under, the versions of us that didn't survive previous winters, and they're still down there, transformed and waiting to be encountered. Water is the unconscious, right? Water is the emotional depths. Water is the place where things dissolve and reconstitute. where solid becomes liquid, becomes something new. And when we talk about being in deep water or drowning in emotion or overwhelmed by waves of feeling, we're using the ocean as a metaphor for internal states that are too big, too powerful, too deep to navigate with our own rational surface minds. So, winter takes us into those waters. Winter pulls us down into these emotional depths, really, the unconscious realms, and the place where we can't think our way through. We can really only feel, only float, or trust that, we won't drown. And the descent into winter is the descent into the ocean itself. Its title, full of things that we can't see and can't control, and really can barely comprehend, but we have to learn to navigate with it. And, like the ocean, it's where transformation happens. And I do want to just have a quick moment here to talk about, some of the parallels of what this internal winter might feel like compared to depression. If you've experienced depression, it might feel sort of similar. And, that's where it really gets tricky because depression and internal winter can really almost look identical from the outside. And even from the inside at first, but there is a difference, and learning to recognize that difference has been one of the most important things that really I've done for myself. And the one thing I do want to say is internal winter feels different in a sense that there's a deeper knowing underneath the heaviness. You might not be able to articulate it, but something in you recognizes that this is necessary, that something is transforming, even if you can't see what yet. And that is, the descent has purpose, even when that purpose doesn't become clear until after you emerge. So, please, as a little disclaimer, I know talking about internal winter can get a little bit heavy, but if you recognize some of the signs, err on the side of caution and reach out to sources and professional help when need be. Another thing I want to mention is when you're in this sort of internal winter, things rise to the surface. Patterns you thought you'd dealt with, wounds you thought had healed, parts of yourself you'd rather not look at, they come up one by one and present themselves. And you might think it's your job to actively work on these things, like any good witch, you're like, oh, I need to do shadow work, to journal or to process, to heal through effort and intention. And sometimes, that's appropriate. And sometimes active work is exactly what's needed. But in this winter, I have really discovered that it's best not to. In the winter, your job is to witness, to see what rises, to acknowledge what presents itself for release and then let it go. Not because you decided to, but because it's ready, because the pressure has done its work, because the part of you that has dissolved, like that larval tissue of the beetle, making room for something new to form. And really, this is vulnerable as fuck, because it means that you're not in control. You don't get to pick what stays and what goes. You don't get to manage the process or optimize the outcome. You just have to trust that whatever emerges on the other side will be what you need to be. And you might feel like you're being pulled by the tide. The moon, the greater self, that higher knowing creates the pull, and you can either fight it and exhaust yourself, or you can let it take you where you need to go. So, learn to ride the current of the emotional tidal waves and not control them. We can obviously do support spell work and ritual and um, things. For me, it's really with the spirits and allowing them to step forward in ways that maybe they don't on a normal day to day. Really, every season has its spirits. Spring has spirits of growth and emergence, the ones who push green shoots through the thawing soil and wake the sleeping creatures, and summer has spirits of abundance and heat, and the ones who ripen fruit and lengthen days, and autumn has spirits of harvest and release, and the ones who loosen leaves from branches and thin the veil between the worlds. And winter has its own spirits, being who thrive in the cold and the dark, who walk when the nights are longest and the world has gone quiet. Hello, Hecate. And who know how to navigate the deep because they've always lived there. Some of these spirits are dangerous, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. There are things that walk in the winter that you don't want to necessarily encounter unprepared. And, if you've heard of the wild hunt, the rides across the sky in the darkest months, collecting souls, sweeping through the world like a storm. There's, of course, Krampus. You know, it's been more of like I don't know how to say, like a commercialized thing, I guess, at this point, but it is absolutely a real spirit you can work with. And there's also the Perkta, the Frau Holle, and the Kalikanstrai. I think that's how you say it. If I butchered it, I'm sorry, but those little Greek goblin imps kind of spirits. These aren't cute holiday figures, not necessarily. They punish. They take, they devour, they represent the genuinely terrifying aspects of winter, and the parts our ancestors didn't romanticize because really they knew better. And winter is not safe. The deep is not safe objectively, and transformation is not comfortable. And the spirits who rule this season reflect that reality. But not all winter spirits are threats. Some of them are guides, some of them are allies for the descent, and some of them have been waiting in the dark for you to come down deep enough to meet them. And I think of winter spirits as the ones who, know how to navigate this deep. They've been there longer than you. They understand the pressure, the cold, the darkness. They can show you where to find what you're looking for, or show you that what you're looking for isn't what you actually need. And you might notice that certain spirits come forward during winter who are quieter or absent during other seasons, or spirits of the underworld, spirits associated with death and transformation, and even spirits of the ocean in the frozen earth or longest nights. These beings have wisdom that's specific to this season, for a good reason. Wisdom about descent, pressure, about what survives the cold and what doesn't. And also, if you work with ancestors, you might find that connection intensifying during winter. And the veil that thins at Samhain doesn't just snap back into place. It stays thin through the dark months, and the dead are closer in the winter. They walk more easily between worlds. They have more to say if you're willing to listen. And some of your ancestors just knew winter in ways that you never will. They survived seasons that killed their neighbors. They rationed food, burned whatever they could find for heat, and watched, unfortunately, children and elders sicken and die when the cold went on too long. And they have things to teach you about endurance, about surrender, about what it takes to make it through to the spring. And you might also encounter spirits you don't recognize, beings who live in the deep and rarely surface, even entities who are drawn to the energy of transformation, who feed on the dissolution and reconstitution that winter requires. And not all of these are friendly, but all of them are not hostile either. Some are simply curious, some are willing to help, and if you approach them correctly, working with these winter spirits requires a different approach than working with spirits of other seasons. You can't command the deep, you can't really demand that winter spirits serve your agenda. You have to approach them with humility, with offerings. Definitely, I up the ante on my offerings. More hearty things for sure. I would say I do a lot of meat, but really it needs to come with a genuine respect for the fact that you're in their territory now. And this isn't the season for arrogance. This isn't the season for treating spirits like vending machines, which it never should be. But when you insert offerings and receive results, this is the season for remembering that you are small and the dark is vast, and that there are powers older and deeper than you who don't owe you anything. And that might sound a little bit harsh, but you know, it's actually quite liberating. When you stop trying to control the spirits of winter and you start trying to learn from them, everything shifts. You're not managing a transaction anymore, you're entering a relationship. And you're asking to be taught, to be guided, to be shown what you need to be, or also need to see. You know, the spirits who come forward during eternal winter are often different from the ones that I work with from the rest of the year. Some of my regular spirits I find go more quiet, not absent, but sort of just waiting and watching and giving me space to do what I need to do. And other spirits get louder, spirits of the deep, of the transformation, and the ones who really specialize in this kind of death that isn't death that winter requires. So really be careful, be discerning, obviously when it comes to working with spirits, not everything that approaches you, in the dark has your best interests at heart. Winter spirits can be tricksters, they can be predators, can be beings who feed on the vulnerable and the lost. And just because something shows up during your internal winter doesn't mean it's there to help you. Just genuinely use your discernment, ask for names, make small offerings before large commitments, and pay attention to how you feel in a spirit's presence, not just during the encounter, but in the hours and the days afterward. Are you getting nightmares or certain things popping up? So, does the relationship leave you feeling supported or challenged? Okay, so let's shift this a little bit. In many of occultist spaces, the winter solstice is treated as a celebration, which obviously there's nothing wrong with that. The return of the light, the sun is coming back, break out the candles and the evergreens and the feasting. You know, we made it through the dark. And while I get that, I understand the impulse to celebrate, but I think jumping straight into celebration skips the important thing, which I really just yapped on about. But it bypasses the actual experience of the longest night in favor of rushing towards the light that comes after. The solstice isn't just the moment when the light begins to return, it's also the moment of maximum darkness. It's the longest night, the deepest point of the descent. And I think that deserves acknowledgement before we, start celebrating what comes next. Think about what the solstice actually is. It's the night when the darkness has reached its fullest expression, when the sun spends the least amount of time in the sky, and the cold and the dark have expanded to their greatest extent, pressing it in all forms from all sides. And if winter is the descent, then I believe it is. The solstice is the bottom, the deepest point, the moment when you've gone so far down as you're going to really go. So this is the moment of that maximum pressure, the maximum cold, dark, really that ocean floor. So our ancestors didn't know for certain that the sun would return at some point, but we know it intellectually now. Obviously, we have science, we have calendars, we have predictions that we can trust, but they didn't have that certainty. They watched the days getting shorter and shorter, and the sun rising later and setting earlier, and the darkness expanding night after night, and they didn't know if it would stop. Every winter solstice was an act of faith. The sun has been dying for months. Will it come back? Will the light return? Will we survive to see spring? They did magic to ensure the sun's return. They lit fires and candles, all this sympathetic magic, fighting darkness with light, showing the sun what they needed it to do. They brought evergreens inside, proof that life persists even in the darkest cold, a reminder that not everything dies in the winter. And they feasted even when food was scarce because abundance attracts abundance. And you have to act as if the light will return if you want it to. This wasn't celebration in the way we think of it now. It wasn't really a party, it was more of a ritual, a collective act of magic designed to call back the sun and ensure survival. And underneath of it really was fear. Real fear, the fear of people who had watched others die in winters past, who knew that the cold could kill them, who understood that in their bodies that the longest night might be their last. So I think there's still power in that, not in the fear itself, but in the honesty of it, in acknowledging that the solstice is a threshold, and thresholds are dangerous, in sitting with the reality that you're at the deepest point of the dark before you start rushing towards the light. So for me, the solstice is a moment to be in the deep, to acknowledge how far down I've come, to sit with the pressure and that cold darkness and say, yes, I'm here. I've made it to the bottom. Not celebrating yet, just acknowledging. But then here's the thing, the light doesn't return all at once. The day after the solstice is only a few minutes longer than the solstice itself. You won't notice the difference, really. Cold will actually intensify in the weeks after the solstice, even as the days slowly lengthen. And winter doesn't end at the solstice, it deepens in some ways, even as the light begins its slow return. So the solstice isn't really a moment of triumph, it's a moment of turning, a pivot point, the exact instant when descent becomes ascent. And even though you can't feel the change quite yet, You might find it, powerful to stay awake through the longest night, to keep vigil in the dark, witnessing the hours pass, being present for the moment when the darkness reaches its peak and begins invisibly to recede. You might find it, powerful to sit with what you've lost, what's dissolved, what's died or is dying in you. And the solstice is a good time for grief and for acknowledgement, for honoring what didn't survive the descent. And especially making offerings to the spirits of winter, to the darkness itself, to whatever powers have been guiding your descent, to thank them and acknowledge their role. You're not done with winter yet, really not even close, but you've reached a milestone, the bottom or the turning point. So really, the magic of the solstice is not rushing past the dark to get to the light, but being fully present in the darkest moment, trusting the turn, and kindling just enough light to remind yourself that you haven't been forgotten. And the sun will return. You'll rise, but first, this, first the longest night, first the deepest dark, and that bottom of the ocean. So let's kind of go back to practically using magic within this season and working with winter instead of just enduring it. And the first thing I want to say is that winter magic is not like other magic, at least for me. It's not about doing, not necessarily about, casting all these spells or making things happen. It's not really about setting intentions and manifesting outcomes and, bending reality to your will. Winter magic is about allowing, about witnessing, surrendering to process that is just bigger than you. And I think maybe this can be a little bit hard for some practitioners just because it's maybe different from what we're so used to doing. We're used to being active, we're used to our magic kind of being something we do, rituals we perform, spells we cast, workings we execute. But we like to feel in control, we like to see results, we like to point at something and say, hey, I did that. My magic made that happen. But winter asks us to let magic be done to us, to be the object of transformation rather than the agent of it, and to stop doing and to start allowing. So this feels like weakness to some people, like giving up, maybe like failure. We've been so conditioned to believe that power means control and that agency means action, that magic means making things happen. But there's another kind of power, the power of surrender, the power of trust, and the power of letting the pressure do its work instead of fighting it. So circling back to that kind of old world magic, winter is when dangerous things came out. The nights were long, the veil is thin, and there are spirits that you don't want crossing your threshold. And most of our ancestors knew this. They didn't romanticize the dark, they protected themselves from it. And in Appalachian and Ozark folk magic, I know that, winter was prime time for warding the home. And you see this everywhere, really. But you'd see salt lines at doorways and windowsills, refreshed regularly throughout the cold months, red brick dust, even mixed with salt at the front step. Practice that came up through Southern conjure and spread throughout American folk magic thereafter. The red for protection, the salt for purification, and the threshold is the boundary between your space and everything else. You could do iron above the doors, horseshoes, railroad spikes, old nails, anything iron to keep out spirits that meant harm. Now, this is the old magic that, stretches back through Celtic and Germanic traditions into something probably even older than that. Iron interrupts, iron blocks, iron, really says, not here, not through this door. And then there's witch bottles, that are buried at corners of the property or under the hearth as defensive magic. Bottles filled with sharp objects, pins, needles, broken glass, along with, urine of the person that it's being protected. The idea is that any magic sent against you gets caught in the bottle, tangled up in these sharp objects, drowned in your essence. And in winter, when hostile workings and hungry spirits are more active, the witch bottle works overtime. Smoking the house is another winter practice, not just for cleansing, though it does that too, but for sealing. You're filling the space with protective smoke, getting it into every corner, every crack, every place where something unwanted might slip through. There's cedar, juniper, pine, the winter plants, the ones that stay alive when everything else dies. Their smoke carries that survival energy, that protection, and the refusal to succumb to the cold. Even in some Latin American traditions, copal serves a similar purpose, purifying and protecting the home, creating a barrier against harmful spirits. The smoke rises and seals the space, creating this boundary between your home and really the hungry dark outside. So the hearth was the center of winter protection magic. The fire that kept you alive was also the fire that kept things out. Feeding the fire was a magical act. You didn't let it die if you could help it, because a cold hearth was a vulnerable hearth, and some families kept specific woods for winter burning, woods with protective properties like oak or ash or even juniper, and the fire consumed the wood and released its magic into the home. So if you have a fireplace, you can absolutely do something just like this. If you don't, candles can serve a similar purpose, or small fires that hold the line against the dark. Keep a candle burning in your window, or um, any ward that you specifically practice in, or just having a small fire if you have a bonfire or something like that. There is also kind of another twist on freezer spells that you could take advantage of here, which is instead of using your freezer, you can put your workings outside and let the season do the work. There's something a little bit more potent here about using the actual cold, the cold that has the potential to kill and does kill things um, on the outside, and really the cold that stops everything. So, also, binding work is supported by winter's energy. Everything is contracted, pulled in, held tight. And if you need to bind someone or something, winter gives you this kind of extra power, and the cold wants to hold things still. So, you can definitely find ways to work with that. And then there's burying things in the winter, which serve as different purposes than burying things in other seasons, I think. In spring or summer, you bury things to maybe grow them, to let the living earth feed them energy. In winter, you bury things to preserve them, to put them to sleep, or to keep them until you're ready. So you might bury a working that you want to have a slow release over time. You can write intentions, wrap it in cloth, and bury it in the frozen ground, and it won't fully activate until the thaw. But it'll be building power over the winter and gathering energy in the dark. You might also bury something that you need to keep safe, or like a secret, a plan, a part of yourself that isn't ready to be seen yet. And the frozen earth will sort of hold it for you. And again, kind of like this preserving action from the cold. Or you might do something a little bit more baneful, like burying something that you want to kill slowly. This is can be for yourself, internal workings, or external workings. But I'll just leave it at that. Let the weight of the earth, sort of press down, uh, pressing and crushing from the weight, or letting the dormancy become permanent. Some things you bury in the winter, you don't even dig up in the spring. You let them sort of rot when the thaw comes, and you let the earth digest it. Using dirt in the winter also can be a little bit different because it has that energy from the winter. So, like for bindings, keeping things stuck at a crossroads, you um, kind of give it this energy of unable to move forward or back because the stillness in the cold, and again, that dormancy of winter. So, also, if you do work with your ancestors or just general necromantic work, working with the dead, they're closer now than, they'll be again until next autumn. And this makes winter prime time for this sort of work. Not just honoring them, but not just leaving offerings, actually like working with them, asking for their help, seeking their guidance, building relationships that will serve you all year. And, winter ancestor work often focuses on this sort of survival. You're asking the ancestors who made it through hard winters to help you make it through yours. You're drawing on their strength, their endurance, their knowledge of how to survive when survival isn't really guaranteed. And, feeding your ancestors more in the winter makes a big difference. They're hungry, they're close enough to actually receive what you offer. Not that they're not at the other times, but it carries a different weight. You know, Warm things like coffee, liquor, tobacco, warmer, heartier foods, like I mentioned, meat. You could do milks and breads, whatever your dead really liked in life, give it to them now. But think about that sort of sustainability when it comes to food offerings. I find that helps a lot. So, tell them what you're facing, ask for their help. Winter offerings, even to the land, should be um, simpler and hardier in ways too, like things that can withstand the cold, that won't necessarily rot or attract pests right away, that can sit and slowly release the energy over time. Water is always great, it freezes, so offer it knowing it will become ice. And, there's even a little bit of magic in that transformation as well, but grains and seeds can be scattered for the wildlife and the spirits, both. Tobacco is traditional and works in any weather. Alcohol doesn't freeze easily and soaks into the ground even when the surface is hard. So, pouring your libations onto the earth in the winter, even when the ground is frozen, the liquid sits on the surface, then slowly seeps into the cracks, following the paths that water always finds. It's slower than summer offerings. It takes longer to be received, but it gets there. And you might also bury your offerings before the ground freezes completely, giving the land something to hold through the cold months. Think of it like leaving food for someone who's going into hibernation. They'll find it when they need it. They'll know you didn't forget them. So the genius loci of your place, the spirit of your specific land, your yard, your apartment, your building, or your block needs tending in the winter, just like any other relationship. Maybe more because, this is when the relationship can go cold if you neglect it. So keep showing up, keep making contact, even if you can't feel the response the way you can in summer, trust that it's being received. So winter is when food is scarce. The birds that stay instead of migrating are struggling, and the squirrels are relying on what they cached. Deer are stripping bark from trees because there's nothing else. Everything is hungry. When you put food for wildlife out in the winter, that's sort of this survival magic. You're saying life can continue here and this place sustains life. Really pay attention to also what comes if you're feeding the animals. The animals that show up to your offerings are telling you something about the spirit of your land. Crows are messengers, watchers, carriers between the worlds. Deers bring gentleness and alertness. Hawks bring vision. Even the squirrels, even the mice, they're all part of it. In, some folk traditions, the animals that appear repeatedly during winter are considered omens or guides. If a particular bird, keeps showing up at your feeder, that might be more than a coincidence. If you keep seeing the same fox crossing your path, pay attention. Winter strips away the noise. What remains is significant. You can also ask the local wildlife to carry messages or do work for you. This is pretty old magic, working with animal spirits not as abstract totems, but as actual creatures who share your space. Leave an offering and make a request. Ask the crows to watch over your property. Ask the birds to carry um, any intentions or prayers up when they fly. And, it's an exchange. You feed them, they work with you. And you can make offerings to the winter itself, again, to the cold, to the dark, to the season as a power. Winter isn't just an absence of warmth, it's a presence, it's a force. And like any force, it can be worked with and negotiated with and honored. When you make your offerings to winter, you're acknowledging its power. And this can be as simple as stepping outside on a cold night, breathing the frozen air, and speaking words of acknowledgement. Or, thank you for the pressure that transforms. Thank you for the dark that reveals. You can pour out water again, and, an offering that transforms as it's given because it's freezing. And again, leaving food for spirits that actually walk the winter. The ones that we talked about earlier. You can light a candle in your window as an offering to the longest night. So at some point, the winter ends. The descent starts to reverse and you start to rise. You might not notice it at first. The shift is subtle, a little more energy one day, a little more interest in the world, the feeling of something loosening that you didn't realize had been so tight. And emergence isn't a single moment, it's a process. Just like the descent was a process, you don't wake up one day and find yourself suddenly transformed. You surface slowly, gradually, in the way a diver rises to avoid the bends. Too fast and you'll hurt yourself. The pressure has to equalize. So pay attention to what comes up with you, what survived the winter, what transformed, what's new that wasn't there before you went under. You won't have controlled this. You didn't get to choose what dissolved and what reconstituted, but you can witness it. You can take inventory of who you are now versus who you were when the descent began. And some things will be missing, parts of yourself that didn't survive the cold, patterns that finally released, beliefs that couldn't withstand the pressure, and let them be gone. Don't chase them. They weren't meant to come with you. Some things will be new, strengths you didn't have before, clarity you couldn't access, parts of yourself that only emerge after transformation, like a beetle that couldn't fly until it went through the dissolution and reconstitution of dormancy. And some things will be the same, but stronger, preserved by the cold, tested by the pressure, proven to be essential because they survived when so much else fell away. So this is really what winter gives you, not just rest, not just death, but this transformation. So when you feel yourself emerging, don't just rush it. Let the process complete. Let the spring come to you rather than grasping for it. You've been in the deep for a reason. Trust that the timing of your emergence is right, and just like the timing of your descent was right. And when you're finally up, finally back on the surface, finally warm again, remember what you've learned down there. Remember what the pressure taught you. Remember who you became in the dark. And winter will come again. It always does, but know that, you know how to dive instead of just drown. Now you know that the deep isn't death, it's transformation. So after all that babbling, that's winter. Not the cozy aesthetic version, not the rest and restore gentle version, but yes, the kind of heavier one. And the one that takes you under and doesn't let you up until you've changed. And if you're entering your own winter, internal or external or both, I hope this episode gave you something useful, a framework, a language, maybe even some ideas for your spell work. But as always, I just want to thank you for being here with me, wherever you are in the world, whatever season you're in. I hope you have a wonderful morning, day, or night.